So this time we thought it'd be interesting to take a different approach, and that is to start, and rather than remaining a blank slate and remaining skeptical, I'll just believe whatever I'm told, and then I'll let that answer lead me to the next place. So that was the goal, is to not just ask them about it, but to take what they say, put it into practice on screen so that people can see it. And so it's a much more direct, I think, way of kind of satirizing these ideas, maybe even than we did in What is a Woman?
Hello, everybody. I had the opportunity today to talk to Matt Walsh of What is a Woman fame. Many of you are familiar with that movie where Matt went out as naive investigator into the world of gender ideology to try to answer the most fundamental question that can possibly be posed to a human being, which is, can you tell the difference between the sexes, which, by the way, is something that creatures without nervous systems have been able to do for 650 million years. So hopefully the answer on your side is yes. In any case, Matt made quite a success with that documentary, and he has a new movie, Am I Racist?, which you can access at amiracist.com. Maybe that's a question you want to be asking yourself. In any case, as many of you know, unless you live under a rock, the issue of racism has raised its ugly head in a massive way once again in our culture since about 2015, mostly because people badly educated at idiot universities have made that the center point of their propagandistic fulmination, much to the decrement of interpersonal relationships across the West, and certainly relationships between the different ethnicities and racial groups. It's really an appalling thing to see. And Matt has decided to hit the hornet's nest once again with this new movie and to launch himself out into the world as a diversity, equity, and inclusivity expert in search of the answer to the question that all white people in particular are supposed to be torturing themselves with, which is, am I a racist? And, you know, that's a complicated question, actually, because human beings have pronounced in-group preferences, which is why we like our families, for example. And there are some downsides to that, like the fact that people who are less familiar to us are more likely to receive a more negative response instinctively, and that we have to fight against that, which I think we were doing with dramatic success before the idiot propagandists got the bone back in their jaw. And in any case, Matt's launching this movie. And we talked a lot about the movie, Am I a Racist? And we also talked about Matt's conservative ethos, right? And how did those two things tie together? Well, people are beating the anti-racist drum, I suppose, because they're looking for meaning in their life. At least that's part of the reason, to the degree that they're just not exploiting the situation. And we talked about sources of deep meaning. And for Matt and for myself, the meanings in our life have really come from our dedication to our wives and our families, our kids and our grandkids, and in my case, because I'm older than Matt. And so we talked a lot about sources of true meaning and false meaning. And so you can join us for that. amiracist.com. That's the URL you want to keep in mind. Join us. Hello, Mr. Walsh. I hear you have a movie coming up. Do you want to tell everybody what it is and when it's breaking and all of that?
Yeah, we do. We have a movie that's coming out September 13th. Am I Racist is the title. And tickets are on pre-sale right now. We opened up pre-sale about a week ago. It's already going, really well on the pre-sale for the tickets, which is important because that, determines in large part how many theaters actually show the movie. So people are responding in a big way, and I'm excited about it.
Am I Racist? September 13th. Well, I suppose we could cut right to the punchline. We'll start with you. Are you racist?
Well, that feels like a spoiler, I guess. I mean, look, one thing we learn in the movie is that I'm white. So I guess the answer is yes. That is how they define racism on the anti-racist side, that if you're white, you're inherently racist. And if you're not, then you're not racist, no matter what you say or do. So from their perspective, the answer is yes. And it's actually, it's unlike What is a Woman, the first movie that we made, obviously, that was a question that they didn't want to answer. It was hard for them to answer. This for them is an easy question to answer. Now, if you were to follow up and say, well, what exactly do you mean by racism? What is racism exactly? Then that becomes a more difficult question. But they have no problem pointing to the people who they consider racist. And really, it's just a matter of looking at your skin color and deciding from.
All right. So maybe we could try this. Maybe I could try to give a case from a psychological perspective for the leftist claims, and we could take them apart that way. And I think it is, it's a hard conversation to delve into because I don't exactly think this is properly characterized as a leftist claim. It's partly that, but it's also partly a claim of devious, manipulative, psychopathic narcissists. And that's not exactly the same as a political or an intellectual claim. You know, just like on the religious front, the religious claims of great monotheistic systems are often hijacked by bad actors and manipulators. That's the Pharisees in the gospel accounts. You see the same thing on the political side. But let's delve into this a little bit because there's plenty to be said about the idea of, well, we could start with implicit bias. So that's something that the scientific community centered at Harvard around Mazrin Banaji and her work on the implicit association test. That idea of implicit bias is something that the scientific has offered to the radicals to buttress their claims. So maybe we could delve into that a little bit because people need to understand this. Is that reasonable as far as you're concerned?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
Okay, so your perceptions, all of our perceptions are biased, and they're biased towards our goals. So when you look at the world, basically what you see is a pathway forward to a goal that you're pursuing. And then you see the things in the world that will either help you along that pathway or get in your way. Everything else is turned into irrelevance. And obviously, when we look at the world, we don't see most of it, right? We see what's right in front of us, for example. But even more specifically, we see a pathway to a goal and things that move us towards that and things that get in the way. And that could be friends and foes, for example. Determine your perceptions in a large manner. Now, there's exceptions to that, like if something unexpected happens, because if something unexpected happens and it stops you from moving forward, that will attract your attention and you'll turn to investigate it. But that's basically the perceptual landscape. And one of the implications of that is that we do live inside something that, if it's described, seems like a story rather than a set of facts. Okay, so this has been more or less understood for something approximating 100 years because the psychoanalytic types like Freud and then Jung kind of cottoned on to this first, that we have a perceptual structure that filters the world when we interact with it. Now, the social psychologists got a hold of that and they built a test that purported to measure implicit bias. And they said that the research is unclear and at best it's speculative and theoretical. They purported to show that we had perceptual biases that favored our in-groups. And that's not really that surprising as far as I'm concerned because, you know, you obviously have a inbuilt preference to care for yourself, and then you have an inbuilt preference to care for your mother and your father and your siblings, and you have a kin preference, and then you probably have something like a tribal preference, and then you probably have a race preference at least insofar as other race people are somewhat novel. And so on that edifice was built up the notion of implicit bias. And of course, the DEI types grabbed the implicit bias literature and ran with it. It was a gift and a godsend to the HR types, the Karens in the HR world, who could then point to scientific validation. And now the Mazrin Banaji of Yale, of Harvard, her colleagues who helped invent the implicit association test, most of them have backed off with regards to its political implications. But Dr. Banaji, who's really quite a leftist, right down to the core, like most social psychologists, is still beating the implicit bias drum. Okay, sorry for the lengthy explanation. You can see that the thorniness of the problem, and that's an important thing to attend to, because the claim that we have as human beings, that we have a bias towards those who are closer to us, depending on the dimension of evaluation, appears to be true. And I'll just close with two things, and then please, push on me. That's implicit or unconscious bias. It's before you perceive. That doesn't mean that can't be overcome by learning. In fact, much of what learning does is modify your implicit biases, right? Because you have to see something a particular way when you first perceive it, but you can learn to differentiate your perception and to become more sophisticated. That's what socialization is for, and that's what education is for. But also, there's no reason to presume whatsoever on the implicit bias front that it doesn't characterize all ethnicities and racial groups equally. So I'm kind of curious about what you think about all that. It's complicated. You know, the idea that we look at the world through a motivated framework, that's a real challenge to the Enlightenment view of rationality. And I'm afraid that the Enlightenment rationalists or the empiricists in particular, who thought that we derived all of our conceptions from sense data, that's not true. It's wrong.
Yeah, well, I don't think I would disagree with anything that you said, but with maybe perhaps the exception of, you said that we've known this for the last 100 years or so. I would argue that we've probably known most of this for as long as human beings have been self-aware, because, just the basic idea that we all are biased and we're all moving through the world in a way that we aren't seeing things like exactly objectively like robots. I think that, of course, that's the case. And we all have our own priorities and preferences and motivations and goals and everything. And you carry that with you and you bring that into every interaction and with everybody and into every situation in your life. Now, as far as that extends to even racial biases, I think history proves that that is often the case also. The problem is that on the kind of quote unquote anti-racist DEI side of this, the issue for them is that, well, there's a couple of things. The big one is that they would probably also agree with a lot of what you just said. And even they would say that it kind of vindicates their point of view. They would listen to that and say, see, this is what we're talking about. Except that for them, that applies to white people only. And if you were to say, well, no, this is just the human condition, everybody is this way, they wouldn't track you that far. They wouldn't go that far. They can't go that far. So that's really the problem. To me, that's the essential problem with the whole implicit bias conversation right now. And it might have been different 50 years ago, but right now, the problem with it is that when we talk about implicit bias, we're only talking about it with one group, and we're not engaging with it as a fact of human nature, but instead as a fact of white human nature, which these people see as something completely distinct and different from, I guess, the nature of all other people who are not white. And then the second problem with the way that they approach the issue is that they see it as something that they have to fix, which I think is an issue in and of itself, because I don't think that it's something they need to fix.
Yeah.
And then all of their prescriptions for fixing it are completely wrong. So there might be a kind of a starting point here where there's some truth in the starting point, but then it just falls apart as you continue along.
I'm taking 4 of my esteemed colleagues and you across the world. Oh, wow, this is amazing. To rediscover the ways our ancient ancestors developed the ideas that shaped modern society.
It was a monument to civic greatness.
To visit the places where history was made.
That is ash from the actual fires when the Babylonians burned Jerusalem from 2,500 years ago.
To walk the same roads.
We are following the path of the crucifixion.
And experience the same wonder.
We are on the site of a miracle.
What kind of resources can human beings bring to a mysterious but knowable universe?
Science, art, politics, all that makes life wonderful.
And something new about the world is revealed.
Okay, so let's delve into that a little bit more. So you said that this has been known, in some ways since the dawn of time. And the idea that people have motivations and goals and that they affect their perceptions, that's key to the whole universe of storytelling, right? Because when you tell a story, this is actually the definition of a story, a story is actually a description of the framework through which someone sees the world. So when you go to a movie, what the movie maker shows you are the goals of the protagonist. So in your movie, Am I a Racist? And this, you did the same thing in What is a Woman? Your goal is to conduct an investigation into something that's key to the culture war. And so we watch you as you pursue your goals, and we can see the world through your eyes, and you're enabling us to do that. And the reason that's so useful is because, well, it's useful for me to see the world through my own eyes, but if I can see the world through the eyes of another person, then I get the vantage point that they developed and that they are learning from without having to take any of the risks. Okay, so now there is a huge issue here, Matt, philosophically underneath all this, because the empiricists, and so they'd be people more on the scientific front, who claim that we derive all our knowledge of the world from facts and from objective facts, they're wrong. And the postmodernists pointed that out. Now, they weren't the only people that pointed that out. And we really don't know what to do with the fact that we see the world through a story, because that's not what the scientists claimed. It's not what the Enlightenment types claimed. And they were definitely wrong. And this is a big problem. Now, my solution to that, for what it's worth, is to observe that we've had evolved ways of looking at the world. They biologically evolved and culturally evolved, and they express themselves in the form of traditional religious views. You know, we can get into that a little bit later. And if those decline or dissolve, then you have the emergence of these terrible ideologies. So, okay, so the implicit bias types and the postmodernists have a point. We do see the world through a story. Okay, now here's an explanation of why it's only white people that are racist from the radical leftist perspective. That's where I see the Marxism creeping in. So what happened when in the 1970s, the postmodernist types, Derrida and Foucault and so forth. Foucault is the world's most cited scholar, by the way, the world's most cited scholar, more than Darwin. So the postmodernists climbed in bed with the Marxists. Almost all the postmodernists were Marxists to begin with, like radically leftist. There's no doubt about this on the historical side. And then Marxism took a vicious hit on the moral side in the 1970s, not least because of Solzhenitsyn, who exposed all the catastrophes of the Stalinist system. And then the postmodernists, the French in particular, they played a sleight of hand game, and they transformed Marxism into a multi-dimensional power game. So for Marx, the axis of oppression was economic. And I think if you had to make a case for an axis of oppression, the strongest case you can make is economic. But the new Marxist types, the type that we see now as the leftist radical, they multiplied that so virtually every dimension of comparison that you could use to categorize human beings became an axis of oppression, right? So race, ethnicity, sex, height, looks, ability, you name it. If it distinguished people, it was an axis of oppression. It was like a metastasized Marxism. And because in principle, white people are at the top of the oppression hierarchy, they're the only ones that can be the oppressor. And then, so this is the real toxic element of the narrative, as far as I'm concerned, that victim-victimizer narrative. It's also empirically preposterous, because it's actually the case that, first of all, white people, depending on how you define white, aren't at the top of the economic hierarchy in the United States. The wealthiest people are Indian Americans from the continent of India, for example, and Asians of all sorts do spectacularly well in the American economy, as do Nigerians. Black women do pretty well, as it turns out, and Asian women do quite spectacularly well. And of course, there's the ever-present fact that Jews do disproportionately well too. And so it isn't even obvious that white people are at the top of the economic hierarchy. But the reason that the radicals insist that racism is only a white problem is because of this Marxism that's crept into the stew. And so, well, I'm curious about what you think about that.
Yeah, well, I think, right, the victim hierarchy on the left is what this comes down to. And I think what you just pointed out, and this is a big problem for the leftists, that they've never come up with anything approaching a satisfactory answer for it. But the fact that white people are supposedly at the top of the pile, the top of the heap, as it was put to me by someone in the film, But Asians are actually above white people. The fact that what you alluded to, that African immigrants do, by almost every measure, significantly better in this country than Black Americans who have lived here for multiple generations. That fact alone is that completely destroys their entire narrative, because you would think that if the hierarchy and the victim axis worked the way they said, then you would think that, Black immigrants would be the worse off, because they not only are they Black, but also they're immigrants, which are supposedly oppressed as well. That's not the case. And that's an easy thing to explain, by the way, because when you look at all of the groups that do pretty well in this country, and then you compare that with their marriage rates and their divorce rates, the math is pretty simple here. Asians do well. They also get married and stay married. African immigrants get married and stay married. White people do. Our divorce rates are not great. Out of wedlock birth rates for whites are going up. And whites also are going down, are traveling down the other way and becoming less successful in comparison to these other groups. So to me, it's there are probably many factors that explain why these various groups perform well, but that's the number one. If there's an exception to this, I'm not sure. I mean, is there an example of a demographic group that has sky-high divorce rates, sky-high out-of-wedlock birth rates, but also performs pretty well economically? I can't think of an exception.
Well, there's an interesting example on the Asian side. So if you bring, say, first-generation Asians do comparatively well in the United States, and their children do better than Americans do. But if Asians are in the country for 3 generations, then their performance declines to the point of the average American. So there's obviously something cultural going on, and it's hard to specify exactly what's going on in the cultures of the immigrant people who do well, but you can speculate, at least, and probably with particular accuracy on the Asian side, that there's a tremendous emphasis on getting the hell out there and working yourself half to death because your parents took the risk of their life by immigrating, and you better get your act together and succeed. And so there's a kind of desperation, I think, that drives the success of the immigrant groups that you're describing. And why that isn't present in our culture, well, that's a hard question too. We don't exactly know what drives people to be conscientious. And conscientiousness is the big personality predictor of long-term success. And conscientious people are diligent and orderly and industrious. More importantly, I would say they probably are good at foregoing immediate gratification and planning for not only for the long term, but also sacrificing themselves for the good of other people. If you're married, for example, you want to make your marriage work, it can't be all about you. And the same applies to your wife. Both of you have to prioritize the marriage over either of your immediate short-term needs. And you really have to do that with kids even more, which is why I don't think people ever grow up till they have kids, because I don't think you can grow up till someone is more important than you are. And that doesn't happen to most people until they have children. And then it's kind of self-evident at that point. And so we don't exactly know what's necessary in a culture to instantiate that ethos of self-sacrifice and conscientiousness, but it does seem to be the case that it's more prevalent among the immigrant communities that do particularly well.
Would you say that this the issue I just raised with the marriage rates, intact families, how much do you think that plays into it? Even like that's a big part of raising kids to be conscientious, is they have to, I would think, have a mother and father in the home who are focused on, instilling that in them. And in the Black community, the rates of fatherless out of wedlock births are, it's like 70, 80%, especially in the inner city. It's just this catastrophic, like apocalyptic type numbers. You can't have a functioning community or a functioning society when the numbers are that high.
Did you know there's nearly $1 trillion of infrastructure and pandemic funds yet to be spent? That's right, there's a whole heap of money that the lame duck administration is pushing hard to spend in their last few months. If the president is able to push these funds out, we could see another prolonged inflation surge, just like we saw during COVID. And I'm sure you remember the terrible effects that high prices had on most Americans. But there is hope. A surge in price can be beaten. A gold IRA from Birch Gold Group is the ultimate inflation hedge for your savings in uncertain times. To see how to protect your IRA or 401k, get your free info kit on gold by texting the word Jordan to 989898. And there's more good news. Due to enormous demand, Birch Gold is offering the 24-karat gold-plated Truth Bomb on qualifying purchases for 1 more month. But you need to text Jordan to 989898 to claim your eligibility before September 30th. Don't wait for the president's spending spree to tank the dollar further. Protect your financial future with gold. Text Jordan to the number 989898 to claim your eligibility and make your purchase before September 30th. That's Jordan to 989898 today.
Yeah, well, we don't know the relationship between fatherlessness, let's say, and conscientiousness. And that's a study that should clearly be done. But we do know probably more accurately than we know anything else in the developmental psychological literature that fatherlessness is a catastrophe. Fatherless kids do abysmally. Well, here's an example, Matt. This is so striking. Everyone listening should take this with a tremendous amount of seriousness. Fatherless girls undergo puberty on average more than 1 year earlier. Now, that's a walloping biological effect, and an early one. And the life expectancy of fatherless children is lower as well, and that's because they undergo chromosomal damage because of stress. So right at the biological level, there are massive consequences of fatherlessness. And probably, having a father is an example of your father, if he sticks around, provides an example of long-term, other-focused commitment across all the ups and downs of life, right? If you have a father who hangs in there, if your parents are honest, you see them contending with each other, wrestling with each other, fighting with each other as they try to sort out the complex problems of life. There's lots of tragedies that a married couple goes through, lots of difficulties, and the example of committed monogamy shows people that it's possible to make a voluntary bond, a contract or a covenant that extends across decades, regardless of the difficulties that life throws your way. And you commented on the accelerating rates of fatherlessness in the Black community, and that is a complete bloody catastrophe. And here's, I think, the explanation for it. Matt, you tell me what you think about this. So imagine a pyramidal structure that represents economic position in the patriarchy. Let's put it that way. Okay, now imagine that you stress the system, and one of the ways you could stress it is by defining the family unit as the fundamental basis of oppression, and that all other family arrangements are fine, and that it's okay to love whoever you want for as long as you want, or for as short as you want, like, let's say, the next hour, and that's perfectly acceptable. And then you throw that into the culture, which is what we did in the early 1960s. And then you might ask, well, who is that going to destabilize first? And the answer to that's crystal clear. The lower you are on the socioeconomic ladder, the more catastrophic the results of a sociological intervention like that are likely to be. And so the Black community tended to be at the lower end of the pyramidal distribution. And so that radical sociological change that emerged in the 1960s affected them first. And Black families started to fall apart in the 60s, and that's been accelerating ever since, until we get the numbers that you are pointing to. But one of the things we should absolutely 100% be clear about is that Hispanics and Caucasians are not far behind. So there has been a decline in marital stability in the white and the Hispanic community since the 60s. And if you match the curves, the Hispanics and the whites are about 10 to 15 years behind the Black community. So that cataclysmic collapse is starting to spread through our entire culture. It's just that the Black population happens to be at the forefront of it. And we know perfectly well that fatherlessness, apart from the biological effects, early puberty for girls, why do girls hit puberty early if they don't have a father around? Well, how about so they become sexually attractive earlier so that a man shows up? How about that for a theory, which seems to be precisely the explanation? And so that's not exactly so good, because probably it's not that good to throw yourself into a sexual relationship when you're still psychologically a child, despite the fact that you might be physically mature. So that's quite the catastrophe. And fatherless boys are much more likely to be in prison, they're much more likely to drop out of school. They're much less likely to attain gainful employment. They're much less likely to be reliable marital partners. And so it's a cascading effect. It's a complete bloody catastrophe. And even the conservatives have been stupid about this. You know, I talked to a conservative leader the other day, and I asked him about families. And he said, well, you know, as long as two people love each other. And I think, no, I don't think so. Not just as long as two people love each other. Love each other, what does that mean, love? Without commitment. You mean, does it mean love for tonight? Does it mean sexual desire? Or does it mean that you're going to commit to someone for decades, for better or for worse? Like, what does love exactly mean?